Science helps explains these things, but in the end, your ability to have, like you said, I'll use some of your terms, have some that organization, structure, routine, give you a sense of power, a sense of self, a sense that you have meaning and purpose, in what in life and what you do,
Sure.
becomes so very important. And I think that you obviously sensed in a very natural way that you didn't want to escape, but you wanted to develop a new routine where your routines have been disrupted.
Testimony continued today in the most notorious criminal trial in Richland County history. Dr. John Boyle is accused of killing his wife Noreen and burying her body in the basement of his new home in Erie, Pennsylvania.
The 12-year-old son finally took the stand.
As I heard a scream, I heard a thud. It was about this loud.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
When I was 12 years old, my testimony sent my father to prison for murdering my mother. This podcast serves as a type of therapy and reconciliation for myself, and it is my hope that it helps anyone who has experienced deception, betrayal, and dark trauma. I'm Collier Landry, and this is Moving Past Murder. Hey movers, what's going on? Welcome back to another episode of Moving Past Murder. I'm your host, Collier Landry. So good to see all of you. Another Friday, another episode. Man, I just got back from CrimeCon in Las Vegas, and it was exhausting. But I got to meet some really, really cool people. And CrimeCon 2022, you were really a lot of fun, even though I pulled like 2 all-nighters in a row getting ready, making these really dope flyers, which I should hold up right now. Oh yeah, here they are. And for those of you watching on YouTube, you can check it out. And I made these really dope flyers with some QR codes and, spreading the word about the podcast. This is me, by the way, on the witness stand testifying against my father in his trial for the murder of my mother. For those of you that are just tuning into the podcast, heard about it and were like, oh, we got to check this guy out. So that was really cool. And this month, it is Mental Health Awareness Month. And I was going to try to follow up CrimeCon with doing like a cool thing about my father or I have this sort of episode that I've planned that's really dope, but it's going to have to wait another week because I want to introduce Mental Health Awareness Month with this particular episode of something that I feel really helps keep my powder dry, if you will. And that is my routine. And for me as a trauma survivor and as someone who's been through my crazy ass life, as you guys know, I appreciate routine, whether that routine is like getting enough sleep every night, going to the gym, working out, swimming, surfing, mountain biking, whatever it is that I'm doing. And when I say surfing, guys, I use that with air quotes because I can't even stand up on the board. It is one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life. But it's having like this physical exercise. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. But first, of course, I want to give a shout out to those of you that are contributing on my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/Collier Landry. I want to thank my Patreon supporters because you guys are just really awesome. I mean, I thank all of you guys for listening, but those of you that are reaching out to try to help support the podcast, that's amazing. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna read your names right now. Heidi Tapio, Kelly Stambaugh, Danielle Tamaro, Maureen E. Vida, Tina Preston, Anna Bofield, Angie Nave, Michelle Lutz, and our new subscriber as of yesterday, Liz Pittman. I want to say thank you all so much for contributing to the Patreon, for supporting this program. Your support it means the world to me. So thank you very much for that. So it is Mental Health Awareness Month. And on that note, I want to read something that Danielle Tamaro, who is our Patreon supporter, sent over to me, which is a post that was from Tiny Buddha Official on Instagram. She sent this today and I'm like, oh, this is so apropos to what we're talking about. So it says, the best minds in mental health aren't the docs. They're the trauma survivors who have had to figure out how to stay alive for years with virtually no help. Want to learn how to psychologically survive under unfathomable stress? Talk to abuse survivors. That is Dr. Glenn Patrice Doyle that said that. And that is on Tiny Buddha Official on Instagram, which was shared by Danielle Tomorrow. So thank you, Danielle, for sending that my way, because that is really cool. It's interesting because while I was at CrimeCon, I interacted with, of course, tons of survivors, and not only true crime fans, but tons of survivors. Kara Robinson Chamberlain, I got to meet her. She was just on the program last week with Tara Newell, and we discussed how survivors go to CrimeCon and how they can deal with that, and sort of tips and tricks and, cheat codes, if you will. Just kidding. There's no cheat codes, but there is, a certain way that you should, like when you're engaging with somebody's story and they've had this like really traumatic circumstance, you don't want to go, hey, so tell me about that murder. It's super awesome. I really love it. No. You want to just kind of, compose yourself. But we discussed that. That was last week's episode. Check it out. Our CrimeCon panel with true crime survivors. On that note, so one of the things that we did discuss in that panel is how things like routine really help us as trauma survivors get through our daily life, right? And again, for me, it's like exercise. A lot of it's like exercise based, or if I feel I don't have enough space, or I don't take time out for myself to do something musical or creative, or like I said, working out, or taking care of myself in general, even if it's something as simple as walking my little Chihuahua Blondie around the block, having those moments in my day when I'm super stressed, everything feels like, it's caving in, and I'm able to just sort of reflect and go, okay, cool, I'm going to get into this routine. But I really like my routine, and this last month I've been really thrown off. I've been traveling, I've been shooting, and I haven't really had that routine that I really have come to enjoy, and that affects me sometimes. Speaking of routine, today's guest is Dr. Angel Iscovich. He is the author of The Art of Routine, and he is here to discuss with me how routine can really help you lead through trauma and your trauma recovery. And being that this is Mental Health Awareness Month, I figured what better way to talk about that than something I'm really passionate about, which is my routine. So that said, I am pleased to welcome to the program Dr. Angel Iscovich.
Do you do director of photography for documentaries or movies? Or I thought I saw some.
Yeah, so I'm a director of photography. So I made a film about my life called A Murder in Mansfield, and it's directed by two-time Oscar winner Barbara Koppel. And but I also work as a DP, shooting commercials, music videos, things of that nature. It really obviously slowed down during the pandemic, and so I got into doing the podcast, which was the continuation of the film. The film was released end of 2018. It came out and did really well, and then picked up a real big audience online during the pandemic. And so I started the podcast last year, and I just got really serious about it this year. And that's how I met Stephen. I was in the New York Post, I was in the Independent, and so I ended up meeting Stephen. And but I still do the DP thing. I just did a commercial 2 days ago. I just got back from shooting a doc. My sort of weeks have been very compressed this month because that's why I said I was off my routine, because I was filming in Washington State, and then there was a whole kerfuffle. There was gear that was stolen. I had cameras go down. Just anything that could have gone wrong went.
Yeah, those are my old stomping grounds up in the Northwest there. Yeah, Washington.
Yeah, so once we got to Seattle, that was where the disasters really started. A drone crashed first, and then cameras and things. It was a nightmare, but I got through it, and then I had to literally come back, and then I interviewed Chris Hansen and a bunch of other people, and I had to do all of that with nothing, no gear, trying to figure it out. And then I had to get all the gear fixed before I had to leave in 3 days. When I got back, I had to go to Northern California and shoot for another documentary, and just got back from doing that. And then am leaving tomorrow to go to CrimeCon for 3 days. And after that, I'm looking forward to just coming back, getting back into my routine, because I'm a very big person into I need to exercise every day. I need to have this. And I think that's something, when Stephen told me about you and he goes, have you ever heard this guy, wrote Art of Routine? I said, well, anybody that's written a book like that, I've got to talk to, because I feel as a trauma survivor, having gone through what I went through, routine is a massive part of and I'm not alone in thinking this, by the way, as I'm sure you could realize, but I feel that routine is so important to working through your trauma. And when I was going through, so has Stephen told you a little bit about me or no?
Yeah, no. I had your history that when you were young, your father, well-educated, ended up murdering your mother, and we're kind of left in the end with a father in jail, no mother, growing up somewhere in Ohio with family or adopted family, and being a little bit of the Cinderella left out, and trying to figure out how that all worked, So those are my own words. I'm not sure that's correct, but
that's pretty. It is pretty good. Pretty good.
I understand the kind of the. I don't know if there was a Cinderella at the end, but kind of really at that age, losing parents and the sort, making for, what happens, and obviously, my background is an emergency physician.
Yes.
Surely I get to see, people at their worst, and some of the worst people as well, in the world that happens, what happens in the emergency environment, which I think that, along with my background in psychiatry early on, then years of emergency medicine, then into business, and from the boardroom from the ER room to the boardroom, I kind of got a little broad perspective. But I think it wasn't just this a reflection of my life, but I wrote this book as kind of an insight into human nature.
Sure.
Not so much to be prescriptive, but being a doc, they want you to give a prescription. I say, hey, this is really interesting, but what's the 1, 2, 3 things I need to do,
Yeah.
And like the art of routine, like the art of medicine, things aren't always black and white, so it's kind of understanding some of this. But to your point, just like now, COVID was an incredible disruption, and you developed, what I call a little bit of a new time bubble, a new routine, a new way of being able to do what you did, which is develop podcasts and the sort. And then and so you develop kind of a new life, and that's what people did. I mean, I think for a lot of people, there was a lot of what I call collateral damage, not just physical or otherwise, but there were also some other collateral values. People learned quite a bit in sheltering in place, not being able to do what they usually do, and consequently kind of recreate what the body really wants, which is equilibrium and homeostasis and stability. And what's different about not just the book, but more my thinking of this, is because it started by looking at people that lived to 100 years old. That was the centenarians and centenarians is where it started. But what's different about this is that I kind of try to put together really how we're wired a little bit, and the physiology of it, and things like circadian rhythms, and as you were mentioning, even the disruption now of suddenly traveling again when you weren't traveling again, and how to travel well, and how it disrupts one's routine, and how do you maintain routine, and the sort. So, you're obviously, and you're very early in developmental age, developed, significant disruption of what I call a little time bubble. That was an analogy, where your life is a bit of a bubble that's flexible, that you do things with regularity, and then things burst as you go through life, and you have to recreate these things again, and try to find that. And that's how our bodies kind of work, whether you look at different physiological functions like circadian rhythms, which I talk quite a bit about because it's a little more understandable, to gastrocolic reflexes, what happens, your body's has a lot of routines happening when you eat something, and to postprandial tides, what happens after you eat, to basically your brain chemistry, or your heartbeat with regularity. So regularity, rhythm, routine are very important parts of the body. The way we perceive the world, just talking a little more macro about things, the sun rises and sets. The sun rises and sets, the seasons come and go. It gives us a sense of certainty. When uncertainty occurs, as it did in your early childhood, and as it does in other people at different degrees in life, this is when things, get disrupted, interrupted, and we get out of this equilibrium, this homeostasis, this rhythm, this what is the importance of routine. And I think part of what I wrote the book about, just so to give you a background, was just that I studied centenarians, we were developing emergency departments for older people, geriatric ERs. And I got fascinated with people that lived 100 years old. And I'd read the book, blue zones and these parts of the world that people live longer. But what I noticed with people that lived longer was that they had two things in common. One is that they had a stable environment, both physical and emotional, around them. And two, that they did things with great regularity, with great routine. But what they did varied tremendously. At times, we'd say in today's world, it wasn't particularly healthy. What the kind of behavior they did that had regularity, one would, for example, say, hey, at 5 o'clock every Wednesday and Friday, I always have my scotch, and then I have my dinner. And so everything was very controlled. I always walk at 3 p.m. or whatever it might be. But other people would say, well, I couldn't live my life. Why do you think you've lived a long life? She said, Dr. Pepper. I have a Dr. Pepper every afternoon at 3 o'clock. And so what it's got me to thinking is that maybe routine might be as or more important than the what you do. In other words, that doing things with regularity, with rhythm, may be more important than what it is you actually do. And in today's world, we're being interrupted with a lot of different things to try, that we can't get into any rhythm, routine, and kind of, so to speak, synchronize the way our behavior with the way our body works. And I started to realize that it wasn't just living longevity, but it was people who were high performers, had a lot of routine that they adhered to.
Sure.
People, and how we care for our young, and businesses, which I've run and worked with, over the years, above and beyond doing medicine.
Could I just ask you something? So it's very interesting what you said. There's two things that I pick up on here. First of all, do you feel that because of these centenarians, and you say something like having the scotch every Wednesday and Friday, or having that afternoon Dr. Pepper, is the way that when we live, do you think, as a medical professional and as somebody who studied this, do you think that not only that is because we're creatures of habit, so therefore because we're creatures of habit, that falls into our sort of, like you said, circadian rhythm of life? And then the second thing is also with that scotch or that Dr. Pepper, or let's say that morning run or whatever, it's like a reward, right? So it hits the parts of the brain, like in the limbic system, and that fire, right? That our reward system kicks in. Is that sort of where you're going with this?
Well, I mean, that's a part of it. Obviously, living to a longer life, for example, longevity, has more to do with simply routine. There's some genetics involved. There's some luck that's involved.
Sure.
To make it. But basically, the kinds of things that we know medically, how our dopamine and serotonin systems work, circadian rhythms, how our cortisol works. There's a reason that at 3 o'clock the English have tea and the Spanish take a siesta, and the French and Italians, at least in those developed countries, have afternoon sex. That's all managed.
Never a bad thing.
Never a bad thing necessarily. But why is that occurs? And this is all brain managed, so to speak, and how we move through cortisol. And this starts to give us a little bit of what our bodies are wired like in the sort. In regard to issues like habit technically is more automated behaviors, and they do work by kind of reward systems. They really come out of our studies in mice and humans, of course, and how to do rewards and positive affirmations and the sort, positive rewards, not aversive. And we know how we stay away from aversive types of things that are painful to us, and how we stay away from it. So there is a lot of that. But what one learns is that routine kind of builds on itself. Routine, I call it a little bit more of an art. The what you do, again, the time bubble, that's just an analogy, is the stable environment that can burst and break from either the inside or the outside, and this time is the routine. But what you do is the art, so that if you decide that what you do when you awake is, and they've done studies on what do people do when they awake, do they drink water? In today's times, often the first thing people do is look at their cell phones to see see who's communicated to them. And others will, maybe develop a certain form of exercise or stretching, Others will make, you've heard of making your bed. The simple fact of being able to do something repetitively impacts your brain and allows you to give you a sense of meaning and purpose that you accomplish something. And when that regularity gets disrupted, the body doesn't like that. On the other hand, when it does it, it does. It gets a sense of meaning and kind of purpose, even in the worst conditions. Even the smallest things that are done with regularity and rhythm help our bodies feel that sense of equilibrium in the sort. So there's a bit of science involved and a bit of kind of more psychological behavior that's involved, but it's really a nature, or it's a human, it's insight into our human nature. And you see this if you look historically. What do people do? Like take COVID, for example. People take war. People have migrated and moved when there's war, when there's pestilence, when there's disease. They move away from it. Their lives become disrupted. I heard an interesting phase on when you look at, for example, Ukraine, or how people have been disrupted with COVID, and you ask them, well, what is it that you seek? I said, I just like to have an everyday life again. So what is that everyday life where you see in a world that people want a lot of stimulation and really changing what we do, so often. And we're naturally curious. Humans are naturally curious and try to improve their survival to find better lands, better water, better shelter, better sense of a place that gives them that time bubble, that equilibrium. And yet life is disruptive as you go through it. And so that's a little bit of, how I think about these things. And in the book, I talk about a number of these situations, like Charlie Plum.
The Vietnam, he's a POW, right?
One of my chapters, even in the worst situations, you find meaning in doing even the simplest things to survive. Or others in business. I have a number of other kind of example stories that I try to tell.
So that it's interesting. You mentioned Charlie Plum, right? Who obviously was a POW, Vietnam POW, much like John McCain, and those little sort of things. Being that my father is incarcerated, right? I often think about. I mean, it's as a trauma survivor, you start to think about, like, well, what if that happened to me? If I'm destined to have that be like, as the prodigal son, I'm going to be in prison or something. You kind of float through these things, but then I think, then you kind of go further down the rabbit hole. Like, what would keep me sane if I was locked up in a box? Oh, routine, right? It's, and it's interesting. And just as I was talking earlier about the travel with the chaos, with shooting here, this location, that location, and it's throwing me off my routine. I wasn't able to go swimming in the morning like I do every day, or get my exercise in, which is a big part of me with sort of my trauma recovery, is exercising and having that. It just makes me feel good, first of all, and it stimulates your endorphins and your, but also it just, it just is part of that thing that I really crave. And when I start to get out of kilter, right, it sort of gets pent up inside you.
You don't feel right.
You don't feel right.
Yeah. You're not having those endorphins trying to get out of the airplane and deal with all the things you have to deal with that you're used to. And that of course is, some chemistry behind why we feel good when we exercise, and which is, absolutely what you're saying is absolutely, it's absolutely the case. And so today's world, we don't exercise regularly because we're not out hunting, and we're not out, of course, gathering and building shelter and the sort. So we form kind of a routine of artificial physicalness, right? The importance to be physical and do those physical things which are important, which then also of course help with sleep and all that kind of stuff. But no, you've hit the mark there. And one of the things about, like, why do you do that? Because you feel good, and you do it because you wake up, but what meaning and purpose does that give you? Why is that meaningful to you? You ask yourself the question, why does swimming every morning, why is that important to me, right? So, I talk to some people about exercise, how you get in a little bit of a zone, how your mind is relaxed, a form of a meditative environment. And you find that just like sleep, our bodies, especially in today's active worlds, require some of this type of downtime, above and beyond actual exercise of your heart racing and the sort. So a lot of interesting things are going on there, but some people don't understand that, what's meaningful to you is not necessarily meaningful to someone else. I noted in my book that my mom used to say, everybody has their own rainbow, and
Everybody has their own rainbow?
Right. And it's just a simple, not a simple saying. And she was a survivor from Auschwitz. She was
yes,
talk
that's what I
about
heard.
surviving, Yeah. And it's analogous to your survival in a different way. You were in a different kind of jail,
Sure, of course.
so to speak, and as your
Well, I was
father
abandoned.
is.
I was abandoned by my whole family. So I was thrown into the foster care system and I was adopted by strangers. I mean, they're not strangers now, obviously, but they were at the time. I mean, knew them through the community, but not, you know what I mean? And it's, I mean, obviously the Holocaust, it's very analogous, but also, it's the betrayal is still there and the trauma is still there and the sort of feeling of helplessness. And I think that like those things, like when you add the routine to that makes you feel more in control. It stimulates, I mean, that's just my assessment of it. I mean, I haven't studied routine, but just my own knowing is like when there's those things, and I guess maybe they're familiar to us or they become familiar to us through routine. So therefore, when those things are taken away from us, we get into that fight or flight mode. Is that maybe perhaps the cause?
Absolutely. If you look at people that have behavioral health breakdowns, right? Whether, what do we do in hospitals? What do we do really in behavioral health? What do we try to start doing with one's life that's been disrupted, either through some disease or even a mental illness or some stress that's occurred? We try to put them in a cocoon. We try to get a routine going. When you eat, when you wake, when you have your therapy session. This happens within, let's say, a behavioral health hospital system. Most of what we do upon stress, trauma, or disease, the kinds of prescriptions, the things we do to help others is to help ourselves, which some people are unable to really ascertain, is do exactly what you said, exactly what you discovered, yourself or through others, of what made you be able to kind of gather yourself back from that traumatic state. And that's the same thing that happens with people that have, severe depression, schizophrenia. Once we get medications that stabilize some of your serotonin levels, then one needs, again, to have that stability, that equilibrium, to have that sense of certainty that what's happening today is a sense of organization, a sense of structure. That's what we do. You remember the story says, my kid, he's just behaves terribly. In the old days, what they'd say is, well, we're gonna send him to military school. We're gonna send him to the armed forces.
We'll get him straightened out.
And what is it that happens in these, what I call, group-related organization structures, routines, is they have obviously a mission and objective, but everything becomes very organized, very structured, right?
Yeah.
And one learns how to kind of find, oneself ability to do those. One might not like the what you're doing in those necessarily, but many people thrive from it. And this is another kind of example of where routine, both therapeutically, okay, but also as our own nature, it's within us, is what we strive for. So that's an example. I remember, sometimes, I'm not sure how it was for you, because you were young and needed, I'm sure, some amount of guidance or develop on your own. I'd be interested, but sometimes you need a mentor. Sometimes when your life's disrupted, you need someone that you could see is organized and structured and has a sense of routine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You look at, you just look at like the inner cities, right? So you have athletes that are coming from very places where routine does not exist, right? And I feel that, what you're, discussing here is something that is very, that exists in our society that ends up sort of controlling populations, or let's just say the prison population, right? Where if prisoners get a little too comfortable, or they're always tossing your cell, or they're moving you to a new cell, they're disrupting that routine before you get settled in, because I feel like when you get settled into a routine, you sort of gain your power, which is why I think it's so interesting and important in trauma recovery, is having that routine does give you your sort of power back. Even though it's the most simple of things, it really has such a dynamic impact on your brain, on the way we're wired. I believe, look, I'm not a neuroscientist, I haven't studied this, but just speaking from personal experience, it enables you to take that power back. I mean, I remember when I was testifying against my father, I was 12 years old, and I had witnessed the murder, I had testified at the grand jury, securing his indictment, and then I would, obviously was in the foster care system, and then testified against my father in court, in front of him, staring him down. It was, 2.5 days of trial. And the thing is that I remember during that time I would play tennis, or I would, I had these little small outlets where I would just try to have some sort of sense of normalcy. Like I just wanted to feel like a kid. There's a great line from the film Shawshank Redemption, which is ironically shot in Mansfield, Ohio. And the character Andy Dufresne, is played by Tim Robbins, does some tax stuff for one of the main guards and asks, he said, what do you want as payment? He goes, 2 beers for each of my coworkers because they're tarring the roof of this factory. And they come up to give him a beer, and he says, no, I don't want to quit drinking. And everybody kind of looked at him like he was crazy. And the narrator, the main guy, Morgan Freeman, says, nobody knows why he did it, but I think he did it to feel normal, if only for a short while. So there's these things that when you're going through this process of extreme trauma, depression, and I think that was the biggest thing with the pandemic, is people couldn't get to the gym, they couldn't get to this, besides all the other things that have occurred, right? And the stresses of being ill, or family members being ill, income, yada, yada. But just those outlets that make you feel normal. And I think a lot of times in society, people get caught up in the rat race. I know I did. Look, I quit drinking during the pandemic, right? And that was a way, when I would drink, I would take time, I'm just gonna check out, you know what I mean? And and that's not healthy, right? And I think that people do things that they get themselves so stressed and so worked up that they resort to unhealthy behaviors to let themselves check out, because they're denying themselves other routine. And that's why I'm keenly aware of it. It's like if I get off my exercise program, or I get off this, or I get stressed, I start to feel a little crazy, and I'm like, okay, I need to focus on me. Just with those simple things, because we do get caught up in like making money, traveling, kids, work, this and that, and we fall off those things, and those stressors kind of boil up inside of us until it bubbles over, and we do something, hopefully not extreme, but we might, and I think it's a wonderful example in the EU. I was just talking about this last weekend, is talking about this, they'll take this 1 month in the summer off, or the siesta, like you said, and those little moments where we think that that's a lack of productivity during those times, but it's really not, because it makes you way more productive, because it just wires your brain in that way. And again, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a medical doctor, you are, and you study these things, so what do you like? Maybe I'm being redundant what I'm saying.
I think you're right on. First of all, that whole sense of I mentioned before, wanting an everyday life. I think that's what Dufresne was about. He wanted the everyday life, feel not like he was in jail, but have an everyday life. Sure. And I think that's kind of the body wanting that routine, that homeostasis, and so forth coming back. So I think you're right, and there's a lot of science behind it. In the end, science helps explain these things, but in the end, your ability to have, like you said, I'll use some of your terms, have some that organization, structure, routine, give you a sense of power, a sense of self, a sense that you have meaning and purpose, in what in life and what you do,
Sure.
becomes so very important. And I think that you obviously sensed in a very natural way that you didn't want to escape, but you wanted to develop a new routine where your routines have been disrupted.
Yeah.
And now you're, sheltering at home, You're not able to go and do shoots and do your work. You're trying
Sure.
to develop and create, again, like I talk about it like a little time bubble, so to speak.
But it is a time bubble, right? It is a time bubble.
It is. And, in the book, I talked at my first note, I kind of learned this when I was doing an emergency C-section as an ER doc, called up to do a C-section on a woman that was in labor, unable to deliver. And, that whole process of being in a womb, kind of as an analogy, because there's a lot that happens, because I studied quite a bit about what's happening, what's the homeostasis, what's happening as you're growing in this womb. And there's a lot of stability and a lot of equilibrium, and a lot going on there too. And then you're born into this kind of disruptive world with all of these sensations, but you're cared for, right? You're cared for and you're grown up. And I think, of course, to you understand that piece very well. But yeah, so in that way, I kind of thought of the analogy of a time bubble. And, I was talking about mentors. I had an insurance inspector that came by, and he's saying, "Oh, I saw the book you're writing. It's really great. Boy, I'll tell you that kind of helped my life." And of course, as a doc, it's always satisfying when somebody, hey, that's good. I really like what I get some nice notes. Some people don't get it because they all want the 1, 2, 3. And my book is not a real 1, 2, 3 book. It's more of an insight into nature that you can kind of follow. But he said his life, he got divorced, he lost child custody, he lost his work. This just kind of a continuing domino effect of kind of what happens with trauma and disruption, whether it's an accident that occurs, whether it's being a pilot. I kind of know I've studied how accidents occur, and if one thing leads to another, and it's a little bit that way, both of what happens in life that leads you down this kind of track, to the point that he lost his work. He was and he had no sense of organization or structure in his life. And arguably he was either very melancholy or clinically depressed to a certain degree, but he was able to get himself up enough to want to get back to exercise, because he remembered that exercise had made him feel good. And he went over to the gym one morning and he started on the treadmill, and he found this kind of older guy that was incredibly organized and structured and exercising, kind of hooked up and became friends with this person.
Sure, it became like a coach.
Yeah, and he mentored him kind of into, well, look, tomorrow we'll do this, but we'll do that. And hey, if you want afterwards, we'll go out for lunch. You have to get some normalcy and rhythm back in your life, to the point that he was able to kind of recover from this and, get a job and deal with the issues related to life, and very thankful and meaningful and feeling really good about where he was at. So these are examples that where, routine, organization, and structure. My point about it is that and the stories that I tell are, whether it was where did you learn that to become such a good business person? Where was routine became important to you?
Yeah.
Or what did you, for Charlie Plum, you're being tortured for 8 years. How did you survive that? And suddenly, there's a spray of bullets that comes from an airplane that opens up the light in his room where he has no light, and he's suddenly able to follow the day. And because he's got a time sense of the day, can actually begin to do things when he exercises, when he eats, when he eat. And so suddenly life becomes, meaningful. So anyway, so I think this is just kind of the way we're wired. I think that we're being a bit disrupted and interrupted now. I see people start on, so let's say a form of exercise like yoga. And they get distracted because then they want to do Pilates because somebody told them to do Pilates. And then they're told, if you do Tai Chi, that's going to be actually something better to do. But, if you do swimming, that's really good because it's good for strength and cardiovascular and no one sticks to much of staying with a routine, trying to let it, develop. Now, there's nothing wrong with changing routines. If you don't like it or it's disruptive or can't work in your lifestyle, people say, well, the routines are boring. I said, well, I'm not telling you what to do. That's the art of routine. You decide yourself what it is you want to do. But when you do it, do it with some rhythm, some regularity. Do it regularly. Your body will like that. You will feel better because of it.
and other human beings recognize that in you. It's like a consistency factor. Like this person always shows up at this time and always does this, right? It's just like delivering episodes of podcasts every 7 a.m. on Fridays. Moving Past Murder comes out, right? And so they start to work that into their own personal routine. So there's so much to be said for that, because, I think part of my upbringing too was, because of everything that happened to me, I kind of became a little rebellious in my view of the world. Like, oh, I'll do it my way because, this didn't work. So I'll, to hell with that. I'll do it the way I feel like doing it. And I think, that ultimately is very counterproductive, first of all, because you're fighting a system that is not, I think when you start to look at these things in a more macro scale versus your own little microcosm of the world of, this is how we're wired as a species. And you need to adapt to that because it's good for you and it's good for everyone around you to behave in this manner, because you can't fight it. You're fighting against nature, and you're not going to win. And I think that that's really key. So you would concur with that, right?
No, I completely agree with that. And I think that sometimes, the rationale is there, but the behavior, they're very disrupted. They can't get in a rhythm. Sometimes people ask me to be prescriptive, and they ask me, well, what do I do? How do I get started? I mean,
well, that's what I want to know. I want you to be able to, so for that, on that note, for our listeners who are struggling with this, and there's a lot of people that are in trauma recovery that listen to this program because of my background. What could you tell them that is going to be most conducive to their path of healing, using the art of routine? So I'll let you answer that.
No. So that's good. So I've tried to become a little more prescriptive, and have learned from some of the stories here that I've told and people I've, worked with, and also my clinical background. So it's kind of funny because I didn't want to give a prescription, I said, listen, it's up to you, to understand this. And then I realized that people say, hey, doc, this is great. Love understanding this, but can you just tell me, this happened in medicine, right? I tell someone why they have this problem or this cardiac issue, and they go, that's great, but can you just give me the 1, 2, 3 things I need to do, So some people don't want to have the deep knowledge, and sometimes that's not what they need. They can't really deal with it even in a traumatic state or situation. So they need a prescription. And we've talked about what we do in a lot of when there is psychiatric disease or stress, and try to organize. So someone asked me that, and I said, well, this was kind of an example of their lives being disrupted, can't get any rhythm, eating poorly, just cannot do well at work. And I told them to get a dog, okay? Because being my wife and I being dog owners and owning actually
dogs like routine. They get thrown off. It's amazing.
When you start, so dogs are like, sometimes they say they're like 3-year-olds. There's kind of a variation. And we talked about, I think I mentioned, that's one of the things I learned is that, caring for the young has a lot of routine involved with it, right? Absolutely. When they sleep, and with dogs, it's the same. So if you want to start getting in a routine, get a dog, and you're going to learn that you need to walk, you need to feed. It begins to feed on developing your organizational structure around the day. Just like you said, when my structure was disrupted, that what I do in my routine, it becomes more difficult to travel. And I talk a little bit about, the travel time bubble, right? How do you maintain a sense of traveling routine, and it's funny because people say, well, I travel all the time, I don't need routine, and then I said, I was talking to a CEO, for example, about travel, and I know this is a little side note to what I was saying. That's one of the prescriptions. So one of the prescriptions is a dog, but the other, people would travel and say, well, I traveled when I needed to. I'd have to go to London. This was in a business way, really moving across. I don't really believe in routines. And I'd say, well, let me ask you this. When you go to London, do you live at a certain time? He says, oh yeah, we always leave in the morning because, I want to be there in the afternoon and so that I can sleep at the right time. I says, well, do you like a particular seat, or do you like a specific area? You don't care what seat you get. So, oh, no, I like my aisle seat. I said, you go to just any hotel or anywhere? I says, oh no, I've got my 2 hotels that I like, depending where my meetings are, and I know exactly the rooms that I want. This is the body wanting to have also not just routine, but physical environment. The hospitality business, hotels have really learned this. In the book, I described a study in the Hilton hotels that try to make them all look the same. This is how they get loyalty.
Sure.
They want you to have the same feel in the same environment.
Yeah.
I had a COO that was working for me, my chief operating officer. I said, hey, listen, you could stay at nice hotels. He says, no, it's a nice hotel. I like the Courtyard Marriotts. I take the same. I said, you have to go to 8 cities for us that you have to work at. He says, I know each flight that I want for those cities. When I go to the Courtyard Marriott, it's always the same. They look the same. I know that I want a courtyard room, not an outside room with the freeway. And so what you find is that people really also want to find physical environments. So this just is my point to the theory that even in travel, one begins, especially if you're like I did, travel quite a bit on business, you start to learn how important it is to have structure and routines, because you're disrupting your circadian rhythms when you're moving, an hour or 2 or 3 hour more out of your time zones when you do international travel. But
Sure.
back to the point, so some things I learned was, yeah, I kind of get this from the dog. That's happened to us. We have show dogs, actually, which I never had till a year or 2 ago, miniature schnauzers that actually show. And so we kind of, you start to learn exactly what's needed in that routine, both for performance and for daily, walking and the sort. So dogs are one thing. Another thing that I've told some people, I say, well, I just don't know what to do in the morning. It just seems I do whatever, depending on what I feel like. I never do the same thing. I said, well, hey, why don't you do this? Let's use a little of your current tech. Take your cell phone and schedule at 7 o'clock. People average time of waking up in the United States is like 6:43 or something. It's actually been studied. Where meditation can be a little more complicated for people because it requires learning a little bit and practicing something. I said, why don't you just do a daily affirmation? So a daily affirmation is something I remember from Stuart Smalley, kind of an old good really little funny movie. That's it says he'd wake up every morning and say, every day he'd do a daily affirmation. It would be like, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me. So one of the simple things to do, and I have that on my phone, for mine it's 7 a.m. and it says daily affirmation. I let that daily affirmation could be something positive, or it could be a moment to schedule what your day is going to be like. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have a good day. So I like daily affirmations. I even like evening affirmations. You can put it and schedule it, pops on your phone and gives you a moment to think. In fact, I noticed that the new Apple phones have a kind of mindful moment now.
Yeah, they do. Yeah,
the
focus
new
and
software
things.
popping up. So obviously dogs, for the requirement of structure, of course, that requires a lot of not freedom and responsibility. That's how you get responsibility and accountability with dog. But affirmations, even in evening affirmations, we're replacing a lot of behavior that happened with religion. There used to be this tradition of night prayers before you went to sleep. So that thankful for the day you had and thankful for the night that's going to happen. And so evening affirmation, becomes a good thing maybe before you go to sleep, to gather your thoughts. Some people do this naturally, by the way. They naturally are organized to think what their day is going to be like. And they naturally, at the end of the day, think of their day and think what tomorrow will be like. So I like affirmations.
I do that a lot, but yeah.
Do you? Okay, yeah. And then, so those are some prescriptions of things that can help you through, how you gain routine and develop trauma, or by starting to do something regularly of that nature. Another one that is kind of a sense of mindfulness, especially in today, is one of the CEOs and chairman of a very large company that I work with, running a pretty big, you got a lot of people in your ear, and it's probably not too different in your life. You've got a lot of people trying to coordinate, a lot of text, emails. You're trying to get a project or get through the day.
Absolutely.
And what he would do is at 3:30, during that time, that circadian rhythm time when you're down with your cortisol and your glucose levels, and Americans are going to Starbucks or whatever, to get coffee and this is fairly natural. Some people is a little bit more of larks, and the circadian rhythm is well defined. He would just pretty much close the door and have quiet time. He'd shut off all of the all of the input and sensations that comes from the computers, the sounds and the sort, and just take a little bit of time quietly to ponder, maybe even to ponder important decisions that may be coming up, but a time where no one's in the ear, you know, in your or her ear. And so I think that was a good practice. He'd do that for about a half hour. It's arguably a form of meditation, a way of regenerating your brain versus swimming, running, whatever it might be one does to do that. So I think that ends up being a good practice. So if I talk about a couple practices, you know, affirmations, a moment of, you know, scheduled quiet time that happens all the time. Nothing gets in the way. You know, nothing gets in the way. It's just like, you know, in people that are religious, nothing gets in the way of someone in the Muslim religion doing their prayers.
Absolutely.
You know, they're set to the time of day. So why is that? Why do we do behaviors like that? So in a modern world, which many of us are much less religious, don't have that. That's why I believe, like for groups, organizations, businesses, for your family, why I believe that you know, routines are important because they become rituals, and rituals become traditions.
Yep.
And it's really important to have ritual traditions. I think we're losing, as just another topic, you know, here about stability, certainty.
We're losing that sense of ritual. Absolutely. I discussed that a lot with my psychiatrist or psychologist that I talked to. You know, it's like ritual and all these things and reward. Dr. Angel Iscovich, thank you so much. I'm sorry this has been a great conversation. I'd love to have you back because you're just a wealth of knowledge. There's so much we could sit here and talk about.
And I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad to talk on. It is kind of an eclectic subject, so it's broad, you know. So
yeah,
both for individual wellness, or if we want to talk about, you know, health and what we do in medicine, or we want to talk about how you implement this in businesses, which I've done, you know, why it's important. So anyway, I've enjoyed it. Thank you. And your insights are very good. You know, your insights from your personal experience are good in why you gravitate and have naturally gravitated to these states. You know.
Well, thank you so much. So how do we find you? Tell us where we can find the book. The book is The Art of Routine. Where can we find all these materials? Yeah,
you know, The Art of Routine it's on Amazon and on any of the booksellers. So just again, The Art of Routine, it'll come up. And I've also got a little webpage, Angel Iscovich, if you can spell it, ANGELISCOVICH.com. And I've got a number of the podcasts and things that I've done that maybe bring a little bit of more depth and insight or interest for other people related to this subject.
Well, my guest today has been Dr. Angel Iscovich. It has been a pleasure. He is the author of The Art of Routine, and we will put all of his necessary and appropriate links in the show notes for this episode. Dr. Iscovich, Angel, thank you so much for being a part of the program. I really appreciate it.
I'm ready to come back and we can talk on a more specific subject than the broad. And Collier, you do a great job, and I know you're helping people.
Thank you so much.
So that was a really cool conversation with Dr. Iscovich, Dr. I. You know, he could just. I'm gonna have to have him back on the program because he can just talk about this because he's really passionate about it. And I think that's really cool for working not only in the medical field of psychiatry and psychology, but he's also known for developing businesses and a business relationship and leaders and entrepreneurs. And obviously routine applies to that, but it also really does apply to when you're trying to work through trauma and you're trying to take care of your mental health and have some stability, because that's the thing, is routine allows you to have a stable ground to rest your feet on, right? And when you're able to stand on solid ground as a trauma survivor, it's so fucking important. I mean, it really is. It really is key to just moving through that trauma, moving past that trauma, and finding your own footing in life. But hey, that's just my opinion, and I'm a trauma survivor and true crime survivor here to share my thoughts with you. But I want to hear from you guys, so please reach out. I am on TikTok now, by the way. Check me out. TikTok.com @CollierLandry. But reach out to me. DMs are always great on social media, Instagram, Twitter. You can email me, movingpastmurder@gmail.com. I love hearing from you guys, and I want to hear your input on these episodes because it helps me create content that I feel best suits you guys, my audience. And that's, at the end of the day, all I really want to do. So on that note, you guys have a great week. I'm Collier Landry, and this is Moving Past Murder. Thanks, y'all. This podcast is made possible by support from listeners just like you. Please subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible. Find us on YouTube, youtube.com/Collier Landry. The film A Murder in Mansfield is available on Investigation Discovery, Discovery Plus, and Amazon Prime Video. This podcast is a production of Don't Touch My Radio in association with RSA Entertainment. Please visit mpmpodcast.com to show your support today.